Welcome to the Bio and Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Satwik Nath, and today we're diving into the world of bioengineering. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dr. Claudia Loebel. She is from the Department of Bioengineering at UPenn. Prior to this, she has been with University of Michigan's Materials Science and Engineering Department. At LOEBEL LAB, among many other things, she researches on developing biomaterials and engineering technologies to improve our understanding of how cells interact with their extracellular microenvironment. Without further delay, let's dive right in. So, why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be part of this podcast. So I have kind of an interesting, I would say interesting journey behind me because it was not straightforward at all. So I'm German. I was born in Germany and I went to high school in Germany and then I went to medical school in Germany and I did not know what science or research is at all, to be honest. And in medical school, I was for the first time exposed to research, and I joined a lab in it was cancer biology, and this is where my journey started. And this was a really, I would say, a brief interaction with the field of science. And then I realized that I needed to learn more. I cannot just go into to becoming a medical doctor, going into residency. And then I decided to pursue a PhD. And my PhD was more in materials, and I'm happy to talk more about this. But basically, through my PhD, I realized that I really love research, and this is where my journey started. Yeah.
Well, what would you say is the main thing that got you interested in bioengineering?
Yeah, so this is a little bit related to my journey because when I started in research, it was, as I mentioned, it was mostly cancer biology, and I didn't even know what engineering was at the time. It wasn't very common, to be honest, in Germany. But then I was always interested in orthopedics because I was in medical school. I was interested in sports medicine. So I became really interested in orthopedics. And this is where I learned the first time about tissue engineering. And this is how I got interested in bioengineering because I realized this is where I can combine the biology with the chemistry that I had learned as a PhD student. And so this is how I initially got interested in bioengineering. And it was really this field of tissue engineering and regenerative medicine where I realized, okay, here's where we need both the expertise of biologists as well as engineers. And this is where we can make an impact in tissue regeneration, basically. So this is how I became interested in bioengineering. And then I realized that bioengineering is a huge field. I mean, it has so many different aspects, and some of these have been covered in this podcast. But this is my journey, basically.
Hmm. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work on tissue engineering and repair?
Yeah, of course. So when I think about tissue regeneration and repair, I mean, when we think about tissues itself, I think the majority or many of us think about cells, right? Every tissue has cells, and we think about how cells communicate with each other. And this is how we started. We put cells in a tissue culture dish, and we understand how they're behaving. But what was most intriguing, or is still most intriguing to me, is that almost every cell within the body is surrounded by this matrix, this extracellular matrix. And this extracellular matrix is a mixture. I mean, it's very complicated, and it's a mixture of proteins, proteoglycans, and of course also different growth factors and enzymes and all these different things. But what is key is that this extracellular matrix provides like very important information to these cells. It's not only, as we thought 20 years ago, just a scaffold for these cells to be in there. No, it provides information to these cells. And it's not just a one way, it's going both ways, right? This is this bidirectional signaling. And there's so many other aspects to this matrix because it is highly dynamic, and it's also very individual to every cell and every tissue. So when I think about tissue engineering, or when I think about tissue regeneration and repair, I mostly think about the extracellular matrix because it is so unique to every cell and it is so important. If you just have a cell, you can't really achieve any tissue regeneration or not profound tissue regeneration. And so I often kind of compare this with when someone moves into a new apartment or into a new office, then you have this empty environment. Yeah, you have this empty room. And the first thing we do is we decorate it, right? We're gonna make it individual to us. We put pictures on the wall, we put things on the table. And so this is a little bit how I see the extracellular matrix because it is so unique to you and it's surrounding you. And so coming back to tissue regeneration, we are excited about this extracellular matrix because if you give cells the right instructions or if you provide cells with the right environment, you have a better, probably a better opportunity, a better chance of regenerating this tissue. And this is why I'm so excited. Of course, it comes with a lot of challenges, but I think what we are most intrigued by is that this extracellular matrix has been largely ignored in the field, and there's a huge potential. Yep.
So, speaking on what you were saying that the extracellular matrix, like the environment, would be incredibly helpful for cellular regeneration. Would you say that's like, is that like a new field or, well, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not really a new field. I mean, we've known this for a long time. Yeah, we
Mm-hmm.
know that there's extracellular matrix. I think many cell biologists, I would say, have basically ignored it. Yeah. And the reason for that is it's very complicated. It just adds an additional layer of complexity into our studies. And so before we had one cell and we were thinking about how these cells behave, what they're secreting, or what's their function. And now we also have to think about what's around these cells. Yeah. And this field has probably really kickstarted 15, 20 years ago when we realized, oh, if we put a cell on tissue culture plastic, a very hard surface, it's very different to when we put a cell on a soft cushion-like material. And I think this kickstarted the thought, oh my God, we have to think about this. Yeah. So it's not a new field, but I think it has a new appreciation in the community. Yeah,
So it became more appreciated recently, basically, compared to long ago.
exactly. Yeah.
So, speaking of your soft tissue replacements, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges in developing these materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's so many challenges, right,
Mhm.
associated with many of the region, but that makes it so exciting. Yeah. So I think that is the most exciting part about research is that once you overcome a challenge, the next challenge is just waiting for you. In terms of soft materials, I think one of the biggest challenge that we are tackling is that soft tissue is, or every tissue is highly dynamic. So, I mean, that's why we can regenerate a wound. That's why we can actually do tissue repair. Yeah? And that is complicated because when we engineer soft materials or for soft tissue replacement, we need to think about this dynamics and we need to engineer it into these materials. Yeah. And this is where the field of responsive materials, like materials that basically they are smart, right? There's so this terminology of smart biomaterials, and that's a challenge. And another challenge that I would like to mention is that we, how should I say this? It's very like the extracellular matrix is very complex. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
not only the composition, but it's also the architecture, it's the structure, and that combined with the dynamics makes it even more complicated. Yeah. So I think many aspects, and we can always just tackle one part of it, and then we need to collaborate with other scientists in the field. But this is one of our biggest challenge, I would say, the dynamics and the complexity.
Hmm. So would you say that, so you were talking about collaboration. Is that how you overcome like the major challenges, or what else do you do to overcome the challenges?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think collaborations are key
Hmm.
because in this, I mean, our knowledge is increasing logarithmically, and we can't keep up. Yeah. So we are experts in a certain area, but with collaborations, we can overcome some of the challenges, especially, for example, from a biology perspective. Yeah. Things that we are not thinking about, or from a translational perspective. Yeah. I mean, I like my lab, for example, I'm a medical doctor, but we're still pretty fundamental in what kind of research we're doing. So collaborating with someone who can push it towards translation is really important, yeah. Or even just thinking about the different chemistries that are really available in the field, yeah. So collaborations are key. And the other approach, how we overcome, or how I would like to overcome it, is with having a team that is highly interdisciplinary. So in my lab, I really like to include students and more advanced postdoctoral researchers who come from very different communities, very different expertise, because then we all speak this a little bit of a different language, but it's very interesting how we bring in these different perspectives, which I think is the way to overcome some of these challenges.
Hmm. So these different perspectives, have they been like really helpful in your previous work? Like how often have you seen these different perspectives? Like you go into something thinking something and then someone else says something and you're like, "Oh, that's a lot better." How often would you say that happens?
I think it happens very often at different levels. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, for example, in my lab, uh, so as you mentioned earlier, I was in a material science department before, and I had a material, or I still have a material science student in my lab, and he didn't know anything about cells before. Yeah. And then we started teaching him what cells are, and then he asked some really good questions that are like they were a little bit naive from a cell biology perspective, but they actually made us think about like a different approach to this material, yeah, and or to this question that we had. So I think from a lab perspective, we have this very often because I really like students or team members who actually don't know anything about that particular field, and then they have a really cool, naive idea, and this is what I want, yeah.
Hmm.
And from a more like a bigger perspective with collaborators, I mean, this also comes very often. Sometimes we specifically approach collaborators with a specific question, but you also need to learn how to ask the right questions. Yeah. So that's why I like to do these brainstorming sessions with collaborators and with students where you just think big. You don't have any boundaries. Yeah. So you're just curious and you just ask questions. So I think it's very often that we have this. Not every idea or not every time it actually reaches all the way to a publication or to a new project idea, but that's fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another question, which medical applications would you say you're most excited about in terms of translating your research into clinical use?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think generally we're still very far away from clinics in my lab.
Hmm.
As I mentioned before, I am intrigued and I'm very excited about the opportunity of incorporating the extracellular matrix into clinical applications. And I think this is one of the, like, how should I say this? It has one of the biggest opportunities and chances to actually make an impact in clinics. And to give you one example, my lab focuses a lot on lung regeneration and repair. And here I'm thinking about fibrosis, which is the scarring of the lung tissue. It's a very fatal disease. Yeah, I mean, patients who get diagnosed with this disease, they only have a few years to live, and we don't have any therapy. We can slow down the disease progression, but we cannot really cure it. And it's clearly an extracellular matrix disease because it is scarring of the lung tissue. But so far, what we've mostly been focusing on is how can we stop cells from making extracellular matrix, or how can we stop cells from kind of contributing to this disease. But the matrix, we haven't really started, like from a clinical perspective, to actually target the matrix. Yeah. And so I think there's a huge potential in targeting this extracellular matrix as a therapy that would make it into clinics. So that's one example. And then the other example where I think where I'm excited about the opportunities is cell therapy for lung regeneration and repair, mostly because I'm thinking about how accessible the lung is. Yeah, so for example, we have done some studies where we have basically injected cells into the trachea, into the lungs, basically, and I think this has a huge potential. Not next year, not within the next 5 years, but hopefully soon. Yeah. So these are
Mhm.
my top applications that I'm hoping to be working on.
Yeah, and hopefully they happen soon because that seems like a big problem that they would be able to solve.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
think so. I totally agree.
What recent developments in tissue engineering or biomaterials do you think will revolutionize the field in the next decade?
Yeah, that's another really important question where when you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different opinions. And when I'm thinking about this, since my expertise and my background is mostly in biomaterials, yeah, and I think about biomaterials a lot like towards also clinical applications, of course, yeah, but just thinking about how biomaterials, how adjustable and how versatile they are. One of the biggest developments are these biomaterials that can respond to their environment. We call them stimuli responsive materials. And I think that's a huge advantage that we have now. So basically, these biomaterials are smart and they react to their environment in terms of, for example, temperature or enzymes or mechanical properties. And if you can design, or we are designing biomaterials that basically once you inject them or you put them in the body, they change their properties based on the environment. And I think that has revolutionized the field and will make big steps towards applications in different fields. I'm not even thinking about a specific application, but just these really cool biomaterials.
Hmm. So you were talking about how it would affect the environment, so of the cells. Back to the when you were talking about extracellular matrices, could it be used in like that sort of application?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think, let me think about an example. So for example, you have lung fibrosis again, yeah, the scarring of the lung. It starts that you have, and it's very heterogeneous in terms of you have parts of the lung that are healthy and you have parts of the lung that are scarred. Yeah, you have a big scar. And when you think about it very simply, a healthy tissue is very soft, yeah, a healthy lung tissue. But a scarred tissue is relatively stiff, yeah, it's much harder. So if you're now thinking about implanting a biomaterial that when the extracellular matrix is scarring, it's gonna degrade and release certain therapeutic factors, then that would basically treat only that region that is scarring. Yeah. So this is one example where the environment will affect how the biomaterial is responding, and you can trigger the release of drugs, you can trigger the release of cells, like certain things that you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really interesting how that interacts with your research.
Mhm.
Another question I had is, what would you say is your favorite research that you have done?
Oh, that's a cool question. I think, to be honest, actually, one of the latest research that we did it in my lab was a material that is also responsive to the environment, but it's basically a magnetic biomaterial. And that means we incorporated magnets. And whenever you put a magnet from outside, that material that was initially flat, and it's just a really cool application, it made these kind of waves, right? So different patterns, and we engineered these patterns into different shapes. And it has certain applications, like we designed it for the application of mimicking certain structures within the body, but it's just really cool if you think about, I never thought I would work with magnets, and then you have this bare material, and now you can just put a magnet and you don't even have to touch that material, but it's making these really cool shapes. So yeah, that's a very cool engineering application and project that I'm also proud of. Yeah.
Uh-huh, yeah,
And
that
this was done by a material scientist talking to a biologist and coming up with this really cool idea.
yeah, that sounds super cool too. So what do the waves actually do?
Yeah, that's it's a good point. So with these waves, I need to go back a little bit into why, yeah, we need to create this.
Hmm.
So if you think about the lung again, yeah, so the bronchus. So if you think about the airways, you're starting with the trachea, which is very large, right? And then you go into the bronchi, and then you end up in the alveoli, which are the air sacs. Yeah. And we all know asthma is a disease of the airways. And in asthmatic patients, what happens is that the airways get constricted, right? And so this is why we can't breathe in, or asthmatic patients can't breathe in. And when these airways get constricted, what they do, when you have one tube and you want to constrict the diameter, what's happening is it's going to fold, right?
Hmm.
And this folding is affecting the cells. And it's like a vicious cycle. You have the folding that is inducing stress on the cells, and the cells become diseased, and then it's just going to continue. Yeah. And it's really hard to study this. Like, how do you make bronchi that have these different folding patterns? And this is the reason we designed it, because we want to understand how these different folding patterns during asthma or in asthmatic patients will affect their cells, and then how basically use this as a model system to design better drugs. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And the app and like creating it sounds really cool as well, using the magnets and stuff. One more question I have is like with all the recent advancements in like artificial intelligence, have you begun using that in any of your work?
No, that's a good question. We started to, but I would say I haven't included it as much as I should. Yeah.
Hmm.
I think, especially with that project that we just discussed, including AI would really help us to, for example, design higher throughput, having different shapes, for example, understand which shape do we need. Yeah. I think, I mean, I know of all the advantages, but we haven't really used it in my lab. But you're making a good point. I mean, to be honest, one thing that we've started to work with are computer scientists or robotics people, for example, that are helping us to streamline the culture and everything of these cells, yeah, and using AI basically to help us optimize this process. But yeah, we haven't really done much in this field. It's a good point. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, so last question. What advice would you give to students who want to pursue a career in bioengineering?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to give advice, but I often think about it because I talk to a lot of high school students, but also undergraduate students early on in their career. And I think the best advice that I got from my mentors early on was that, yeah, follow your curiosity, follow your passion, right? So what are you interested in? And the one thing that I was told is, because in the beginning you don't even know what is out there. Yeah. So bioengineering is such a huge field, and I would definitely motivate or encourage everyone to go into that field, but it's huge, right? And so my advice is that kind of trying things out. Yeah. Because sometimes you need to know what you don't really like. Yeah. Even in the bioengineering field. Yeah. So I always give this advice: try certain things, like different specialities with bioengineering, to understand what's out there, and then, follow your passion, because there's no one good way. Yeah. For any of us. Yeah. So it's a very individualized path. And the other advice that I got early on and that I give all students as well is that kind of develop this network of mentors around you. Yeah, because you it is very good to have mentors with different perspectives and who can advise you on different aspects of your career, but also of your life, right? Because the career needs to be integrated into your life. So having a network of mentors has been very important. And I think it's always been a good advice from my mentors to have multiple mentors who can give you advice, but also like give you different perspectives.
Yeah, that all sounds like really good advice, and hopefully people will use that advice and to for their future. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we end?
Well, this is a really cool podcast, and everyone who's listening here, I mean, I always enjoy talking to students and kind of showing you what we do in the lab. Yeah, so if you're interested, if anyone is interested who's listening to this podcast to hear more about the lab, but also to hear more about this path, right? This career path, I'm more than happy to chat more. Yeah, so please feel free to reach out anytime.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up this insightful episode of the Bio and Beyond podcast, I want to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Loebel for sharing her wealth of knowledge and expertise. Her commitment to the field of bioengineering and her passion for academics is truly inspiring. Stay tuned for more captivating conversations at the intersection of biology, medicine, and technology. Until next time, this is Satwik Nath signing off from the Bio and Beyond podcast. Remember, the exploration never ends. There's always more to discover.